button, hit the notifications bell. Always good to have you here. We are doing a lot of streams this weekend. We are trying to close out the month of October with a bang. Head to Nicaragua after a lot of streams. It's going to be great. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. The way this works is I give my opening remarks. After I give my opening remarks, we do the roll call where I call you out as I see you, names and locations. Then after that, I answer your super chat questions until the show is over. That's the way it works. So basically, if you have something you want me to talk about, just shoot me a super chat and I will shoot you an answer. I may not give you the answer that you want, but I will try to give you an answer that will be sufficient. I'll do the best that I can. And that's how we roll here. Yeah, it's starting to be a little chilly here in New York City. My body is adjusting to the fall and the cold wind, and we're getting ready for our trip to Nicaragua for the elections. The John Brown volunteers, a few of them, and some of the Center for Political Innovation people are headed to Nicaragua. So I'm very excited about that. Getting my COVID test on Monday to make sure that I don't have COVID so that I can get admitted into Nicaragua. And yeah, I'll be there through the elections. We'll spend a good 5 days in Nicaragua for the elections to be on the ground to show solidarity with the Sandinistas and the anti-imperialist government there that the U.S. imperialists can't stand. So that's how we're gonna roll. And so for those of you that are members of the Patreon community around this YouTube channel, you will get to have a patrons only stream on Monday. It will be on Monday. We'll have a patrons only stream that we're going to have on here. When do you think it would be right to form a political party in the United States? All right. To form. That's a good question, and I'm writing it down. So that'll be on Monday, November 1st. We'll have a patrons-only stream. So if you want to be part of the Patreon community, now is the time to sign up. The link is down below, just right down there. Just click, 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 right down there. You can sign up and be part of the Patreon community. We always have nice little intimate Patreon streams. I send the Patreon people my books a lot. They get their own copies of my books. It's a nice little community to be part of on Patreon. It supports the work of the channel. It supports the Center for Political Innovation and what we do, and it's also kind of intimate. You get kind of intimate access to me. I speak a lot more frankly on these streams, on the patrons-only streams. I'm thinking about there's a controversy going on with a certain political organization in the United States. I can't talk about that publicly, but my patrons have the right to know about it. They're going to hear about it on the stream. They're going to hear about it on the patrons only stream because they're part of the community. I don't want it all over the web, but I do feel like my patrons here deserve to know about it. I'm going to talk about that on Monday on my patrons only stream. So there you go. Talk about the reactions of American socialists when they first visited the USSR. All right. Oh, very good. Very good. Writing that down. And so if you want to sign up, that would be the place to do it. You can just sign up. In other news, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, we just had a great web conference here tonight for the Center for Political Innovation. Speeches from Keaton and as well as Travis, a professor at Humboldt University, and Keaton Mansfield of the John Brown Volunteers both gave great speeches. Char Darling, a great member of this community, also known as Charlotte, delivered a beautiful piece of poetry. Daniel, Students and Youth for a New America activist in Austin, Texas, played the piano beautifully. Great Q&A session. It was a very lovely web conference we had earlier tonight. So if you want to go back and watch that web conference, by golly, you ought to do it because it was pretty nice. It was a pretty nice web conference. Pretty good, pretty lovely conversation. So there's that. And we are getting ready, as I said, to send our delegation to Nicaragua next week. So fingers crossed on that. Wish us the best. And we're going, right? I intend to do 2 streams tomorrow, one in the early afternoon and one in the late night, just to finish off the month of October. So we are going and going and going. We are going to talk. I am going to answer your questions, and we are going to have a lot of conversation. This online community that we have built is great. Just before I was getting on here, there was somebody who said to me, they said, I live in Manhattan. I'm a teenager. I've been watching your videos for a while. I'd like to join your reading groups. So I traded information. He's hopefully going to join our reading groups. That's great. And I got to say, shout out to anyone in the audience who is a teenager during this pandemic. My heart goes out to you. Folks, the pandemic, the lockdowns, and wow, they were bad for adults. They were bad for me. I'm an adult. I have my life set up. I have a good paying job, and I live in an apartment, and I'm married. And the lockdown sucked for me. I could not imagine being a teenager at the time of the pandemic, living in my little town with my family and not being able to go any place. I would have lost my mind. I would have just gone bonkers. So I don't know how you teenagers do it, right? I'm seeing, another friend of mine is talking about her SAT scores and, talking about her SAT scores. And, another friend of mine is talking about different stuff going on. And my goodness, and the other thing is when I was in high school, there was only one social media outlet. It was called MySpace. And I didn't have one, and most people didn't have one. And it was just a thing that people had. And like the biggest social media related drama that ever happened at my high school, I remember, was that there was a girl who, as a prank, video recorded herself punching a guy in the groin, and then posted the video on her MySpace, and then she got in trouble for that. So there you go. Oh, Helen Woolley is headed to Venezuela for their election in November. That's November 17th. Well, that's great. That's towards the end of the month. They're having their election. Wow. Well, great, Helen. I hope that you go. You should give us information about it. I will interview you when you come back if you want to be interviewed, Helen. If you want to be interviewed, I can interview you on this program. You just say the word, and we will have you give a firsthand account report back from Venezuela. Helen, you are a beloved member of our community. You're an Australian comrade, and we will definitely have you on here to talk about what you've seen in Venezuela. That's great. I'm really happy to hear that you're going there. That's great. That is really, really great news. And, but yeah, there was no social media when I was in high school, really, except for MySpace. There was a girl who filmed herself punching a guy in the groin, posted the video online, and got in trouble. That was like the biggest social media thing that ever happened. But now with social media in high school, these high school kids, they endure a lot of social media bullying, a lot of social media cliquishness. So if you add the social media aspect and you add on top of that the pandemic, I could not imagine being a teenager at this time. It must be really, really hard. And the fact that there are so many teens in our audience, my heart goes out to you. It really does, and I hope that I'm able to bring you some hope in these dark times, because this is not a great time to be a teen. It wasn't a great time to be a teen. When I was a teen, there were plenty of problems in the world, no doubt. But let me see if it gets better. Oh, you can see my face better that way. Okay. But yeah, my heart goes out to you. My heart absolutely goes out to you if you're a teenager now during this pandemic. I was thinking about that today. But for my opening remarks tonight, I didn't get a chance to read it, John. Didn't get a chance to read it yet. But for my opening remarks tonight, I wanted to talk about a couple things. The first of which is a news item that came to my attention. And it came to my attention. So every year in Washington, D.C., they have a big anti-Iran conference, like the Free Iran Summit, it's called. The whole thing is paid for by the Mujahideen Khalq, right? And it's this conference, a fancy conference at a fancy hotel, all about how Iran has an oppressive government and the people there need freedom. And all kinds of American politicians speak at it. This year, Mike Pence, the former vice president, spoke at it. Um, Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, he spoke at it. And it's this huge conference, but they often don't give any publicity to who is putting the conference on. They just make it sound like it's just people in Iran who want freedom, right? Wouldn't you want freedom if you were in Iran? They have this evil government, the Ayatollahs. Wouldn't you want freedom, right? I mean, it's just they depend on our ignorance, right? They want us to assume the Iranian government are evil. They want us to assume that anyone who's opposed to them is just some people who just want some democracy and human rights against an evil regime. But I did see that Business Weekly, because they didn't like Mike Pence, it was a hit piece on Mike Pence, right? I mean, there's plenty of Democrats who go to this conference, but, because they don't like Mike Pence, they decided to do a hit piece about how Mike Pence attended a conference, and it was sponsored by the Mujahideen Khalq. And this is very important. This is very, very important because the MEK, Mujahideen Khalq, is a very dangerous organization. A very, very dangerous organization. And they are one of the main anti-Iran lobby groups in the United States. They are like the foot soldiers of neoconservatism. They are murderers. They assassinated Iranian nuclear scientists. In Iran, there were some nuclear scientists. One of them was a college professor. When I was in Iran, they took me to the spot where he was killed. He was walking to class, and a member of the Mujahideen Khalq walked out and killed him, gunned him down right there. And the Mujahideen Khalq, they assassinate nuclear scientists in Iran, but that is just the tip of the iceberg. All right, so I'll tell you who the Mujahideen Khalq are, the MEK. So at the time of the Islamic Revolution of Iran, 1979, the Shah was forced to step down. And as the Islamic Revolution of Iran, I didn't see that, John. I'll have to check that out and get back to you on that, John. I'm sorry, that's a very important point. But the Mujahideen Khalq, at the time of the Islamic Revolution of Iran, there were three major communist parties in Iran. The first was the Tudeh Party, right, which was the Communist Party. I think Tudeh means like peoples or something like that, but it was the Communist Party, the Tudeh Party of Iran, Tudeh, Tudeh. And then there was another party called the People's Fedayeen Guerrillas, right? And they were a group, they were like Maoists that advocated an armed guerrilla warfare strategy in the countryside. Maoists, Gaverans, they were trying to wage people's war or whatever. And they were inspired by Cuba, inspired by China, etc. They were, more left, I guess you could say. The Tudeh Party was more involved in the labor movement in the cities. The Fedayeen were in the countryside. But there was this other group that was called the Mujahideen Khalq, and that means the People's Holy Warriors. The People's Holy Warriors. Mujahideen is holy warriors, and Khalq is of the people. So the holy warriors of the people. And they followed a guy named Masoud Rajavi. Masoud Rajavi claimed that he was the second coming of Muhammad and Jesus and Lenin, all combined into one, and that he'd been sent to the earth by God to create a global communist Islamic revolution. They called themselves the Islamo-Marxists. They were Islamo-Marxists, and they were followers of Masoud Rajavi. And they took hostages. They kidnapped American diplomats. They blew up buildings, and they were a terrorist group that followed Masoud Rajavi. At the time of the Islamic Revolution, at first, they were big supporters of it because they overthrew the Shah of Iran. They were against the Shah, and the Ayatollah Khomeini had an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist message. So they seemed sympathetic to that. But after Khomeini fired and removed a religious leader who was sympathetic to them, at that point they went on a killing spree. They blew up the Iranian parliament and killed 81 members of the Iranian parliament. They conducted all kinds of assassinations and killings. And the current supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, he cannot move one of his arms because of the fact that they they bombed one of his press conferences. When he was a cleric, he was having a press conference, and they bombed one of the press conferences. He's now disabled in one of his arms because of the Mujahideen Khalq. And then when Iraq invaded Iran, you had the Iraq-Iran War, the Mujahideen Khalq formed their own armed group they called the Iranian National Liberation Army. And Saddam Hussein airdropped them into Iran, and they proceeded to raze villages. They would go to villages and slaughter entire villages as the Iranian National Liberation Army, and they went into villages and slaughtered people. They were, ruthless. I mean, they've got tens of thousands of deaths on their hands. This is a very, very violent organization, very bloodthirsty, murderous group. After the Iraq-Iran War, which they were on Iraq's side against Iran, they couldn't stay in Iran, so they had to go to Iraq. And in Iraq, they were used as Saddam Hussein's foot soldiers. Whenever there would be some kind of uprising or something against the Iraqi government, they would send the Mujahideen Khalq people, to go and do it. And they had a camp, in Iraq. And after the U.S. government, after it invaded Iraq and overthrew the government, they started working for the United States. They were no longer working for Saddam Hussein. And from their Camp Ashraf in Iraq, they shot missiles into Iran and killed Iranians. They smuggled heroin into Iran from their Camp Ashraf. They took people as hostages, as prisoners, and they would drag them around by their necks, with ropes around their necks, and drag them around, and torture them that way. I mean, they're just a very vicious organization, very vicious group of people. And you can read, it's not just, you don't trust me, you don't trust Caleb. Go read what Human Rights Watch has said about the Mujahideen Khalq. Go and read what former members have said about it. There's plenty of people that don't like the Iranian government that really don't like the Mujahideen Khalq. They are a vicious group of murderers and extremists that the U.S. government has been coddling. And so, just like Bush, just like Obama, and now, just like Trump, they had their rally, and a number of Democrats spoke at their rally and cheered for them, and it's pretty unbelievable, right? And U.S. media, because they're working for the United States, because they're trying to overthrow the Iranian government, because they kill Iranian nuclear scientists, the U.S. government has no problem with them. What's crazy is that because they were the foot soldiers of Saddam Hussein, they were designated by the U.S. State Department as a foreign terrorist organization because they've killed Americans, which they have. They were a designated foreign terrorist organization. But Hillary Clinton delisted them. It was Hillary Clinton, a Democrat, when she was head of the State Department, Secretary of State. She's the one who said that they're no longer legally designated terrorists. However, while they were on that list, from the time the U.S. invaded Iraq all the way up until 2013, when Hillary Clinton pulled them off the list, that entire time, Rudy Giuliani was hanging out with them. Donald Trump was hanging out with them. Who else was hanging out with them? All kinds of conservatives. John Bolton, big neocon, he was hanging out with them. Mike Pompeo was, it was like, while they were a legally designated terrorist organization, that caused absolutely no qualms. There was no problem on the part of the U.S. Elected officials for fundraising for them, speaking at their events and all of that. And that goes to show you how the terrorism laws are not fairly enforced. If it is a very serious crime to fundraise or do anything to support a legally designated terrorist organization. But yet, all these mainstream American conservative politicians, they hate Iran. Okay, we're working with them, and never got prosecuted, never blinked an eye. Nobody said anything about it. It was just considered to be, okay, that's what they do, right? And it was unbelievable when there were people like the Holy Land Foundation, right? In Texas, there was the Holy Land Foundation. It was a group of Muslims who raised money for feeding children, for feeding Palestinians. They just fed Palestinians. It was, the Holy Land Foundation. and they fed Palestinians. They ran soup kitchens to feed hungry Palestinians. Right. To feed hungry Palestinians. Wrote it down. And after 9/11, they charged them and they put the leaders of the Holy Land Foundation in prison. They put them in prison for feeding children. Go and read about the Holy Land Five and what was done to the Holy Land Foundation. It was horrendous, the treatment that the Holy Land Five have endured. They just ran a charity raising money for Palestinians. They put them in prison for aiding terrorism. And at their trial, they didn't even name a terrorist group that they had supported. At their trial, the prosecution brought on an expert witness who said, that list of designated terrorist organizations, it's really hard to get groups on that list, and you never really know. And they never actually found a designated terrorist organization that they had given money to. They just said, well, somehow some of this money that went to aid Palestinian, Palestinian children, theory of truth, that aid Palestinian children, some of it could have gone to a terrorist, and they put them all in prison, the Holy Land Five. It's a horrendous thing. Meanwhile, an actual legal designated terrorist organization called the Mujahideen Khalq was fundraising in the United States, had Tom Ridge speak at their events, had John Bolton speak at their events, had Rudy Giuliani. Nobody cared. And then finally, Hillary Clinton finally just took them off the list and said, you're not terrorists anymore. But it shows that law enforcement in the United States, especially around the issue of terrorism, is ridiculous, right? If they want to go after somebody, they could. They could go after them. If they don't want to go after somebody, they don't, right? It's that simple. It's ridiculous. The Holy Land Five, they couldn't name what terrorists they'd helped. Oh, they still jailed them for aiding terrorist groups. And, then there was blatant fundraising for MEK when they were a designated terrorist group. They've murdered Americans. They've razed whole Iranian villages. They shot missiles into Iran. They smuggled heroin into Iran. But nobody cares. It's just like, whatever. Even that list from the U.S. State Department of designated terrorist organizations is very selective. Groups get put on that list for very political reasons. But even that list doesn't even really matter at the end of the day. That's what's so unbelievable about it, right? Is they don't even enforce their own rules. The rules they make are already biased and ridiculously biased. They don't have the Free Syrian Army on there, even though they slaughtered Christians and murdered people and destroyed Syria. They don't have them on that list. They don't have the groups that were tearing up Libya. They don't have them on that list, right? Yet even that list that is so biased, where they only seem to put on some groups and they don't put other groups on the list, even that list, they don't bother to enforce it. So it just shows you how ridiculous all of this is. And at the end of the day, I just wanted to highlight that and bring attention to that, because I saw them, okay, they're attacking, and the way they're spinning it, right? I saw Business Weekly. Good for them, right? Good on them. They wrote the piece, criticize, that's good on them. But at the same time, it's like, Mike Pence is a bad Republican and he's talking to a bad group of people. It's like, no, that is just the tip of the iceberg, my friends. U.S. imperialism is bad against Iran, and part of U.S. imperialism being bad against Iran has been building this crazy extremist counter gang called Mujahideen Khalq, and U.S. media has been repeating their propaganda endlessly. Every few years they come out and claim they have proof that Iran has nuclear weapons. This is classic, right? So they were claiming that Iran had nuclear weapons, Mujahideen Khalq did. And they produced a picture of the safe where Iran keeps its nuclear weapons secrets. There's a picture of, this is the safe. We have a picture of the safe. I didn't know that about Turkestan, Islamic. I didn't know that. We have a picture of the safe. We have a picture of the safe where the Iranian government keeps their nuclear secrets. Well, a couple people did some research, and they just typed into Google Images, safe. The image that they produced came from a French website that sells safes. They got online and they found a picture of a safe, and they clicked on it. They clicked save image, and And then they presented it to American media as if they had proof that Iran was developing nuclear weapons. That's how dishonest these people are, right? And but yet U.S. media reported it. The Wall Street Journal, oh wow, the MEK says they've got proof. All these media outlets took them seriously as if their allegation was totally true. I mean, it's ridiculous. And then if you get up and say Iran is not developing nuclear weapons, has never had nuclear weapons aspirations, has completely 100% followed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, if you get up and say that, they treat you like you're crazy when that's a fact. These are facts, and they treat you like you're crazy. But on the other hand, if the Mujahideen Iqalq get up and say, they photocopy a picture of a safe from a website and hold it up, they take them seriously. This is how ridiculously biased American media is on issues related to Iran. I just wanted to bring that up and just talk about that. And so it's like, I'm glad to see they're attacking that. It was one thing I noticed is that, on January 6th, when Donald Trump's supporters, ran into the Capitol and acted like idiots, at their demonstration, a lot of these counter gangs the U.S. government has cultivated around the world, like the Mujahideen Khalq, like the Miami Cubans, like the Falun Gong, a lot of them, okay, why? A lot of the reason, wrote it down. A lot of a lot of those groups attended the demonstrations against in support of Donald Trump. And I noticed that in the lead up to the election that happened, in the lead up to the 2020 elections, the New York Times did a hit piece on the Falun Gong. And I was like, whoa, that's usually nobody touches the Falun Gong with a 10-foot pole. They're like untouchable. But because they were big supporters of Trump and because Epoch Times was shilling for Trump, I guess that gave them permission to go out of that. So it shows that there's trouble in paradise, I guess, right? These counter gangs that the CIA has cultivated around the world are all very illiberal, right? I mean, Mujahideen Khalq, those folks are not liberal. According to the article in Business Weekly, if you're a member of the Mujahideen Khalq, you have to keep a journal with all of your sexual thoughts in it. And every time you have a sexual thought, you have to write it down and you have to show it to the leaders of you. That is not a liberal organization by any means. Falun Gong is not a liberal organization by any means, right? And that in order to fight, in order to defend the liberal order of Western capitalism, right, our liberal open society where everything's a matter of opinion and the individual becomes above all else, in order to defend it, we've had to build up all these illiberal cults, right? We've had to, you got the Moonies in South Korea, the South Korean Unification Church that runs the Washington Times. You've got the Falun Gong. You've got the Mujahideen Khalq. You've got all kinds of very illiberal authoritarian movements that are used as foot soldiers of the liberal order to fight against other illiberal forces in the world that are also that are opposing U.S. imperialism. So it's like liberalism, and this is a point I have made over and over again on these streams, is that liberalism cannot exist without propping itself up on a pile of illiberalism, right? I mean, the policing agencies are authoritarian organizations. The U.S. military boot camp, you think that's not brainwashing? You think that's not authoritarian? You think the U.S. Army is a free-thinking, open liberal institution? I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, so it's like you can't have liberalism without a big pile of illiberalism to prop it up. But yet, at the same time, liberalism can't come to terms with the fact that it's dependent on illiberalism. And the illiberal institutions that U.S. imperialism has used to prop itself up seem to be at odds with U.S. imperialism. And that's what we saw on January 6th. That we saw Donald Trump was putting out vaguely illiberal messages, kind of giving off authoritarian vibes. And he mobilized all the cults, the Moonies, the Falun Gong, the Netanyahu supporters from Israel, the MEK. He mobilized all of those people. All of those, the Shah supporters, you name it. He mobilized all of those pro-U.S. imperialism illiberal groups to go and like storm the Capitol. And that's what happened. And that shows that these illiberal groups, when it gets down to it, they have an agenda that is not in line with the liberal order of U.S. imperialism, right? And that is the contradiction, that liberalism is collapsing in and of itself, and there's, it's dependent on illiberalism, and eventually we're going to see liberalism collapse into illiberalism, and that's called fascism, right? When liberalism collapses on itself. I thought that was one of the greatest points Haas ever made. He defined fascism. He said, fascism is when liberalism collapses into illiberalism. That's basically what happens when the liberal economic system of capitalism becomes so unstable and so insecure, and there's so much of a threat of a socialist revolution that liberalism just collapses into illiberalism. And that's the process that we're seeing right now. That's what we're seeing. But anyway, before we go to start answering super chat questions, I did want to, just kind of go over. So I get, I keep wanting to cancel my subscription to The Economist, but it keeps coming, and I just never remember to cancel my subscription. And they do have this useful, This Week in Politics. And before I have gone over just a couple of the news items that they have, I found it a useful thing. I can just kind of, point to, they give you like, this is just what happened, and then I can tell you like what's really happening. So I thought I would do that here. So the first one that I wanted to talk about, so we got President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt lifted a 4-year state of emergency. In theory, it will now be less easy for his government to quash protests and arrest dissidents. Critics wonder how much less easy it will really be. America has threatened to withhold aid from Egypt unless it improves its human rights record. So for those of you who are not familiar with what happened in Egypt, right? So in 2011, you had the Egyptian Revolution, right? In 2011, the people of Egypt went out into the streets and they overthrew the Egyptian government. U.S. media was like supporting it, but basically social media was stirring it all up. And one of the groups that was very big in making it happen was the Muslim Brotherhood, right? The Muslim Brotherhood, which is funded by Turkey and funded by Qatar, and they are longtime CIA assets. The CIA used them in Egypt to work against Abdel Nasser and Arab socialism. And, Al Jazeera was promoting the revolution. And the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a pro-Western religious organization, they believe in capitalism. They're not Wahhabis. They're not like the Saudis. They believe in, quote-unquote, modernity. And the Iranians refer to them as westernized Muslims. They went out and they, along with, the labor union, it was a big mobilization. And the longtime dictator of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, was overthrown. So Mubarak was removed. And then the Muslim Brotherhood won the first election and became the ruling party. And the Muslim Brotherhood, the CIA-funded Muslim Brotherhood, that's, tied to Turkey and tied to Qatar, they were doing pretty crazy stuff. They were talking about sending the Egyptian military to Syria to fight against Assad. They were doing some crazy stuff. And on top of that, a lot of people in Egypt don't like them because they've assassinated people. They've engaged in a number of assassinations. They are religious fanatics. They are CIA. And so the military overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood president. The Muslim Brotherhood president, Mohammed Morsi, was toppled by the military. And so al-Sisi, the military leader, he took over, and he became the military leader. And when he came in, it wasn't clear, right? Now, most of the leftists in Egypt supported the military taking over because they hated the Muslim Brotherhood so much. However, there were some articles saying that China lost out because, the Muslim Brotherhood was, willing to negotiate with China. It was a complicated situation. It was a very complicated situation. But ultimately, the Muslim Brotherhood was toppled, and al-Sisi, became the leader. But al-Sisi, as much as al-Sisi is somebody that, he comes out of a military that was trained by the United States, he's friendly to Saudi Arabia, at the same time, al-Sisi, it seems like there are some city-building tendencies of al-Sisi. For example, he's talked about expanding, expanding electrification of Egypt. He's talked about working with China to do it, and it seems like the United States doesn't quite trust him either, right? Because again, right, as much as the Muslim Brotherhood folks, the USA seemed to like them, but then was unsure of them, and then vice versa. And it seems like, the situation is very fluid in Egypt. Now, at this point, the military is in power, but they've lifted at this point the state of emergency. When they overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood, they declared a state of emergency in order to crush the protests by the Muslim Brotherhood. There were some very bloody, like violent massacres that happened afterwards. But now that state of emergency is lifted. And the United States is criticizing Al Sisi because they see Al Sisi as a potential strongman. Al Sisi, in theory, could, start building infrastructure, could expand China relations, could, the military in Egypt goes back to Al Nasser. Gamal Al Nasser, the socialist leader. And the military was a big part of the socialist policies of Nasser. And so, with control of the military, Sisi could start moving Egypt in an anti imperialist direction. He has not done that. But there's fear on the part of the United States that he might. And so, at the same time, it seems the United States is putting some pressure on Al Sisi. It's quite interesting to talk about. Now, the next item we have on here, Israel moved ahead with a plan to build 3,000 new homes for Jewish settlers in the occupied West Bank. The Biden administration condemned the plan, and it may increase tension in Israel's governing coalition, which includes dovish parties that oppose settlements. Yeah, and this is what the Obama administration used to do too. Every time the settlements would expand, they would go, "Oh, how dare you?" and they would condemn it. But then they would still giving Israel huge amounts of money, not taking any action to stop Israel from doing it, right? And this is part of the game that's played, right? And that the settlements, the settlers are particularly vicious to Palestinians. If you see some of the videos, those settlers who go into Palestinian territory and force people out of their homes, where they bulldoze the homes of Palestinians and take their homes, those settlers are very, very nasty people, right? They are some of the most racist elements. They take a lot of, they'll sit on their roofs in their settlements and watch the bombs, fall on men, women, and children, and they'll applaud and they celebrate. They think it's really awesome. When Palestinians get blown up, they think it's great. They, I mean, you should, you, I mean, they're very mean spirited. They'll find a home that they want. They'll find a Palestinian home that they want, and they'll just show up and they'll just start dancing and celebrating. While the military comes and clears the family that's lived there, and elderly people are being dragged out of their homes so these Israeli settlers can live there, and they'll just celebrate and all of that. The Israeli settlers are vicious, right? And many Israelis oppose the settlements, as I just read there. Many in Israel think what the settlers do is horrendous, there's many people that are supporters of Israel, that look at what the settlers do and are just horrified. It is very vile. I mean, they are very vicious people. And they harm the Palestinians. They treat the Palestinians with blatant cruelty. It's all okay. There's been weird things where they'll take a Palestinian and they'll draw a Holocaust number on their arm. Have you heard of? I don't know if you've heard about this. There was a documentary, The Iron Wall, it was called. It showed that, and they think they draw Holocaust numbers on the arms of Palestinians, because they think it's revenge for the Holocaust or something. There's weird stuff. I mean, and again, there's many people that are supporters of Israel even that say the settlements are not okay. I know, Ben and Jerry's ice cream is still doing business in Israel. They're just boycotting the settlements because they just feel like the settlement activity is just wrong. But the USA, every time the settlements expand, they make noise about it. They say, "Oh, Israel, you shouldn't do that. Don't do that, Israel." And then they nothing happens, right? Nothing happens. So it's pretty wild stuff. But then I'll go on to read the next item here. Israel held its biennial blue flag military exercise over the Negev desert. Aircraft from America, Britain, France, India, and other countries joined the drill. The head of the United Arab Emirates Air Force also watched. The exercise pitted Israel and its allies against a fictional country called Dragonland, which has military capabilities remarkably similar to Iran's. So Israel's basically rehearsing war with Iran. Israel's rehearsing war with Iran. And that brings us to the next item. A cyber attack in Iran disrupted the sale of subsidized fuel, resulting in long lines at petrol stations. A group calling itself the Predatory Sparrow claimed responsibility, but the authorities blamed an unnamed state actor. The hackers also took control of digital billboards, making them ask, Khamenei, where's our fuel? Ayatollah Khamenei is Iran's supreme leader. So basically, this hacker group, which Iran says they have evidence that it's linked to a government. I'm thinking Israel, I'm thinking United States. Iran hasn't said, but they're claiming that this hacker group linked to a government. It hacked, and made it, with computers, screwed up the ability of the subsidized fuel to be distributed, number one. And then, on top of that, it put up billboards, it arranged for billboards to go up everywhere, blaming the Iranian government and the supreme leader for having the fuel prices go wrong. That's particularly interesting, isn't it, right? That's what's going on, right? They make a big deal when, there's some cyber hack here in the United States, and they always want to tell us immediately that it was Russia that did it and all that. And it's like, it sounds like some state actor is doing it against the Iranians. But there you go. Now, here's another item. The UN has said that more than half of Afghans would go hungry this winter without help, and that the proportion who subsist on less than $1.90 a day has risen from roughly half before the Taliban seized power to a shocking 97% by mid-2022. Afghanistan would become the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Residents of Kabul are selling their possessions on the streets in order to buy food. Wow. Think about that. Think about that. I mean, it's absolutely horrendous. And we have frozen, again, what they're not saying in that article, what they conveniently left out, what The Economist conveniently left out, is that the USA has frozen all of Afghanistan's money. There's billions of dollars that belong to Afghanistan that they could use to buy food. There's millions of dollars. Before Chavez. There's millions of dollars they could be using to buy food that we've frozen in our banks here in the United States, and we're not giving it to Afghanistan. We stole all their money. The United States has stolen all of Afghanistan's money. There's about to be a famine over there, and they're going to starve, and they're going to say, well, that's what happens when the USA pulls its troops out of countries. Look, they were so much better off since we, would I go on Tucker? It was so much better off, when the USA was occupying. Now we pulled out, and they're starving. Yeah, you stole all their money. All the money of the Afghan government. The Afghan government was a U.S.-backed government. They kept all their money in the United States. The U.S. government has frozen Afghanistan's money. So the USA pulled its troops out of Afghanistan and then it froze all of their money. And so now they're about to starve. The country's going to starve, and U.S. media is just kind of ignoring the fact that they're going to starve because we froze all their money. I mean, you talk about a big omission. Talk about a big omission of fact, something that's a little bit important if you're going to report on this. They're going to start a country where people are starving, and we froze their money. It's the same thing with Venezuela, right? They say Venezuela's problems. The USA has frozen all of Venezuela's money and put up sanctions to prevent them from importing food, and grabbed Alex Saab and dragged him to Miami because he dared to try and feed the people of Venezuela. This is like, you do this to countries, and then you say, oh, look, that's what happened. I mean, this is evil. I mean, this is just maniacally evil, right? They create a food crisis in Afghanistan, And then they freeze all their money, and then they go, oh, look, well, that's what happens when you don't have troops over there. When you don't occupy countries, then they all starve to death. Well, no, when you force a country to put all of its money in American banks, and you occupy the country and you spread instability in that country for 20 years, and then finally you just leave, but then you freeze all their money so they don't get any of their money. Yeah, at that point, yeah, then people starve. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, they're about to starve millions of Afghans just to make the point that US wars are good. I mean, this is ridiculous. Give them their money. Unfreeze the money, for goodness sakes. I mean, I mean, goodness gracious, goodness gracious, goodness gracious. I wanted to just touch on two other items here. Um, Members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations convened virtually. Myanmar was excluded since its military mounted a coup in February and has been slaughtering protesters since then. It was the first time the group has sanctioned a member state. So here's what happened. Will CPI reach out to members of other religions? Of course, right? But I can touch on that. Reach out to members of other religions. All right. But I mean, so Myanmar military junta has run the country for a long time. And a military junta has run the country for a long time. And then under the Obama administration, Obama was able to maneuver some opening up in Myanmar. What that meant was that because the military junta in Myanmar was drifting closer to aligning with China, right, which it was. Okay, let me back up. All right, so during the Cold War, the United States was very afraid of communist revolutions spreading all over the world. So, in many countries around the world, the United States, propped up various military juntas and strongman regimes to be a barrier against communism. Right? In South Korea, you had Park Chung-hee and Syngman Rhee. In many countries, right? You had various figures, Pinochet in Chile, and and in Argentina there was an authoritarian regime, military juntas in Argentina, and that many countries around the world, Rios Montt, Guatemala, you had, because the United States didn't want communist revolution to spread, you had these authoritarian regimes brought into power. But then, after the Soviet Union fell, things started to shift because those authoritarian military states could only stay in power if they were handing out the goods. They had to have a section of society that was loyal to them. And so, in a lot of cases, they engaged in kind of Bonapartist economics, right? Park Chung-hee built South Korea, right? He raised living standards in South Korea quite a bit. He was brutal, he was vicious, and much of the population really suffered, but he created a middle class. He built POSCO, like a state-run steel industry. He created, car companies and technological manufacturing companies, and in doing so, he created a middle class that was able to secure the military dictatorship. And that's generally what you have to do, right? If you're going to create an authoritarian state, a military state, you have to have a layer of the population that are benefiting from it and support it. And if you don't, it's going to be overthrown. So these various military juntas the USA was backing, like in Myanmar, it was the Myanmar government was backed by the United States. They handed out the goods, and they created a layer of society that was loyal to them. And they were brutal, and they killed any communists and any leftists or dissidents. They killed them, and the USA backed them. But then, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the USA started saying, yeah, why are we losing money? Letting these countries have, their own industries, letting these countries have economic protections for their industries, letting them tax, American companies that go there in order to build their own industries. So you had neoliberalism and the open society of George Soros, and the idea was force these military juntas and these strongmen to open up, and instead of having an authoritarian state that could hand out the goods and be stable, have them have an elected government that is so weak that we can just force free trade and neoliberalism on them. And it was a shift. It was basically a shift. And so in South America, the USA had brought Pinochet to power, but when Pinochet was brought down, the USA kind of went along with that. And in many countries, you had the United States supporting an open society against these military dictatorships because they didn't want these military dictatorships to hand out the goods. They wanted open free trade and neoliberalism. Well, in Myanmar, the military junta basically, started drifting closer to China because China was going to do business with them and was going to trade with them on friendlier terms. And so, the United States became less friendly to that junta because it wasn't going along with the openness. It wasn't, opening itself up to free trade. It was doing what military juntas and dictatorships do, which is it was using Bonapartist mechanisms to stabilize the economy. So it started getting closer to China because China would do business with them. So then, at that point, Obama started pushing for openness in Myanmar. And Obama was saying, we need to have more human rights in Myanmar. We need to have more. And what that was about was the USA needed to have more influence there. They didn't want this authoritarian government that could get in the way of free trade and neoliberalism. So Myanmar was opening up, and Obama was pushing that. But now the coup has happened. Now Myanmar's, military has, overthrown the elected government. And so now the coup has happened. So Myanmar, solidly back in the Chinese camp. U.S. influence in Myanmar has been cut off. And as a result of that, now the United States is furious and is taking actions against Myanmar and trying to punish Myanmar. And that's kind of what's going on there. Now, I favor human rights. I don't favor brutal dictatorships of any kind. I think, I don't support the Myanmar government overthrowing the elected government. I don't support that. But, you have to understand that there was fear of jihadist groups and ethnic violence related to Muslims in the country. There was fear of the United States bringing instability to Myanmar. And as a result of that, there was popular support for the military, which is more pro-China, overthrowing the government. Now, I don't support that, but what I'm telling you is that the USA doesn't care about this because it cares about human rights. The USA cares about this because that military is pro-China. And that military, the way it stays in power, is it's a Bonapartist regime where it hands out the goods, it takes care of a layer of the population, it secures some level of economic development in order to stay in power. The USA wants Myanmar to be dirt poor. The USA wants Myanmar to be Guatemala. It wants Myanmar to be Honduras. It wants Myanmar to be an impoverished country with a open elected government and poverty everywhere. That's what they want. That's what the USA wants, and the Burmese military is not going to allow that, right? So there's a level of nuance to all of this, right? Myanmar is definitely not a socialist country by any means. It is definitely a capitalist state, but it's a capitalist military junta, and it is an authoritarian regime. And now, in the era of free trade and neoliberalism, what the imperialists want is they want an open international system. And so, again, it gets back to some of these contradictions. So there you go. And then the other item I wanted to touch on was Pope Francis agreed to visit Canada to take part in the country's process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Hundreds of unmarked graves were found earlier this year at the sites of former residential schools of Indigenous children, most of which were run by the Roman Catholic Church. Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, vowed to improve relations with Indigenous Canadians. He's still taking flack for skipping the first National Day of Reconciliation. Yeah, I don't know why the Catholic Church doesn't just immediately apologize. You read about the conditions of those residential schools. It's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. And the fact that there's been any hesitancy from the Vatican is just horrifying. And I hope that the Pope goes there and apologizes and apologizes and apologizes and apologizes and apologizes. Because those residential schools, we had the same thing here, right? They weren't run by the Catholic Church here. They tended to be run by Protestant churches here in the United States. But where they beat the language out of these children and treated them badly, gave them new names, wouldn't let them have their culture, took them away from their parents. It was horrendous. It was absolutely horrendous stuff. And I don't know why the Catholic Church doesn't just immediately apologize for this. I mean, it's cultural genocide. Now literal, and the conditions at those schools were causing the death rate among those children to be high, right? I mean, that's pretty well documented. The fact they're finding all these graves where these bodies were buried, they weren't marked, right? There was no gravestone there. They're just, they would just bury these children when they would die. The rate of death among those children was significantly high. And I mean, you look into the conditions there, I mean, it's just absolutely awful. It's just absolutely awful. I don't know why there's any hesitancy. Why did Kevin Trudeau go surfing? Would Justin Trudeau go surfing rather than do something in support of the indigenous community? Why did the Pope? I mean, why hasn't he just immediately apologized for this? And what is going on? What in the world? I mean, this is just a horrendous situation, an absolutely horrendous situation. So there you go, folks. Those are my opening remarks for tonight. And now I'll start answering super chat questions. But before we do that, we do have our roll call. So names and locations, folks. I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations, names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. TN is with us, JT24 in Mississippi, Raphael in Brazil, Zachary in Richmond, Vermont, Michael in Ithaca, New York, Enoch in Australia, Kieran from San Diego, Mobile, Alabama, Nicholas Lynch, St. David's, Bermuda, Chaya from Montreal is with us, Christian in northern New Jersey, Kendall in San Diego, Clyde Bank, Nate, Virginia, Covega in Washington, Micah in Las Vegas, Danny in Illinois, Glendale, California, Crizzy Cruz and Noah Loza, Michigan, A Better America, David in China, San Miguel in Mexico, St. Louis, Io Hillary in New York City, shout out to you, Kurt Milani, Andrew from Van Nuys, California, John in Houston, John Whitty, Ian from Beverly Hills, Michigan, Upper Peninsula, Indonesia, Tony from Tasmania, Sin City, Ohio, that's Cincinnati. Shout out to you, Jenny Lynn. Jeff from Canada, Keaton Mansfield, Damascus, Syria. Wow, you've been miles to go before you sleep, Keaton. Miles to go before you sleep. Springfield, Missouri, Andres, Norway, Aziz, Sydney, Australia, Mike in Arcata, Chillin in Chino, California, says Space Communist, Seattle, Auckland, New Zealand, Pomona, California, Colin in North Carolina, Stephen, Riverside County, Southern California Desert, says Kinky. Well, shout out to you. Joey here in our unknown location in the New York City area. Well, shout out to you, Mr. Yankee Tanky Joey. Shout out to you. The only state split in half. Sam in Australia. Mike in Fort Bragg, California. Temple City, California. AJ from NJ. Very good. Finn in Duluth, Minnesota. Keep asking those good questions, Finn. Quinn in Meredith and Eatonville, Washington. Shout out to you, Quinn and Meredith. Tulare, California. South Island, New Zealand. Knoxville, Tennessee. Ghostly Robot, welcome. There you go. The wreckers are after you, Caleb, but we have your back. Hey, I'm used to it. I'm used to it, folks. I'm used to it. I'm used to it. Vinicius from Brazil. Jason from Georgia. Piha from New York, Red Illuminati, shout out to you, and Bayonne, New Jersey. He's got a great YouTube channel. Check it out. Don't agree with everything on there, but he's doing good stuff. Arturo from Alaska, Finn in Duluth, Jim Thorpe from Pennsylvania, Space City, Texas, Elias from Finland, Vladimir from Venezuela, Akata. I'm Akata too, Bodega Man, says Gleb. Well, shout out to you, Gleb. Fresno, California, ATX, Ziolet, that's Austin, Texas, Settled Land, USA, hi from Mexico, U.S. occupied Sweden. Is Sweden U.S. occupied? I wasn't aware of that. But there you go. There you go, folks. John McCarthy near Chicago. Shout out to you, John. And thank you, John, for bringing me to Jimmy Dore's attention. That was great. That was great, the Jimmy Dore. That was great. Jason Hunt is out in Chicago. I think you can be a mod, Jason. You're a mod, Jason Hunt. David Rennie in Hamilton, Ontario. There you go. There you go. All right. There you go. Cleveland Pirate Alex. Shout out to you, Cleveland Pirate Alex. Good stuff. All right. All right. So if you have a question for me, by all means, just shoot me a super chat, and I will do my best to answer it. When is it best to form a political party in the United States? Well, okay, there's a couple questions here. What purpose would this political party serve? If you're going to participate in the elections in the United States and you are not a Democrat and you are not a Republican, generally you'll need some kind of party to run with. Now, there are people who just run as independents and don't put a party next to their name, but generally It helps if you put a party next to your name. There are Marxists who have joined the Green Party and used it as an electoral entity. There are Marxists that have formed into the Socialist Party, which is kind of a loose coalition, a lot of different, views in the Socialist Party. But if you're looking for a party that will actually take power, that will actually be a vehicle to represent the working class, right? I mean, if you're looking for a party that would actually become the ruling party of the United States, I assume the person is asking this about why I formed a think tank and not a party. I'll tell you that none of the parties in the United States are really parties, right? And none of them are really parties. And the way you can tell that is that they're small, they don't have a mass base among the population, and they have been stagnant for years. These parties are not new. Most of them have been around for a long time. Some of them are relatively new. PSL started in 2004. I mean, that's a long time ago. I mean, but I was in high school at the time, but it's like okay. I mean, they're still they're what maybe they're relatively new speaking. Socialist Alternative has been in the United States not that long, since like the 90s. But most of these parties have been around forever, and they haven't really grown or expanded or developed a mass base among the population. Um, and but even for that, right? Because a party's going to start small. But here's the thing: that a serious party, the way a serious party would function, the way a group that was actually trying to take power would function, is it would want allies. Did you know that? If a party was actually trying to move toward taking power, toward actually taking power, it would want allies. When the Bolsheviks were on the brink of taking power, they allowed Trotsky to join, and they allowed all kinds of people to join them because they were serious about taking power. When Hugo Chavez was trying to build socialism in Venezuela, he got the endorsement, when he ran for president, from the Communist Party. He got the endorsement of other candidates, other forces backed him. And then when he took office and started moving Venezuela towards socialism, he formed the United Socialist Party, and he urged all the different socialist groups to join it and put aside their differences. That's not the way socialist groups in the United States act. The way they act right now is they act in a very competitive way. I'm right, you're wrong. And they view people, when somebody new comes along, Abu, I would have been 1 year old when you were in high school. That's a wild man. Well, there you go, Keaton. I mean, when a new party comes along, right, it's always viewed as a competitor. And so if I were to form a new party, right, if I were to announce that I was forming the Caleb Maupin Party, I wouldn't call it that, right? I'd have to give it like some communist sounding name. I'd form like the Communist Workers Revolutionary Party League, right? And then immediately everyone in the Communist Party would be my enemy, because they would insist the Communist Party was the real party, not my party. Everyone in the PSL would be my enemy. Everyone and that's the way the left works, right? Is that it's all these little tiny irrelevant groups walking around going, my group is better than your group, and your group sucks. No, oh, well, thank you, James. I do appreciate it, and much support to you. And it's not serious. It's not serious. The leftist parties in the United States are not serious. None of them have any seats, in Congress. None of them have any seats in the U.S. Senate. I mean, there's a couple. I think there's a mayor who I've interviewed, or not a mayor. There's a member of city council in Wisconsin who I've interviewed, who's a member of the Communist Party. Great guy. Wazea Whitebird seems like a nice guy. There's a couple other people around the country that are friendly to the Communist Party, but they're very low level. And it's none of these parties are serious. They're all just kind of, they're groups of activists that are very competitive with each other and trying to prove something. I don't want to, I'm not interested in that anymore. I spent years and I studied this stuff, the Spartacist League and the Revolutionary Communist Party and the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and I studied the differences between these groups in depth. I was fascinated by these groups. It was entertainment for me. Now I'm not interested anymore, because none of these groups are going anyplace. None of these groups are getting anything done. And so I formed a think tank, because I'm not interested in forming a new party, because if I form a new party, then I'm participating in this silliness, this charade. And if I formed a new party, I would be telling the working class, vote for me, not the Democrats or the Republicans. In the United States, that's what people understand parties to be. There are two major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. If you form a party, you're asking the working class to take you just as seriously as they would take the Democrats or the Republicans. And I'm sorry, but if you go to the working class and say, vote for me, I'm in this tiny little communist group that doesn't even have 100 members, they're going to laugh at you and they're going to realize you're a joke, right? But a think tank is different than a party. A think tank is a place we can develop policy solutions. It's a place we can conduct socialist education among the broad masses of people. And it's a place we can guide people who might engage in electoral work, might engage in street activism. We're a think tank because we're trying to get out of the mindset that comes with building your own special communist party. I am not interested in that. I am not interested in trying to destroy the Communist Party because I have the one true party. No, I know a lot of people in the Communist Party who are great. They're awesome. I know a lot of people in the Socialist Party who are great and are awesome. I know a lot of people that are in the PSL. They're great and are awesome. I even know some people in Trotskyite groups that are good people and are awesome. And I would like to influence all of those people with my ideas. And I don't want all of those people to become my followers and join my one true party. I'm not interested in that. I want to put out material that they will read and think about and will be influenced by. I want to have conferences that their organization, members of it, might come and give a speech at, might come and listen to. I want to help advance socialist thought. I want to conduct political innovation. That's what I want to do. I do not want to form a new party because forming a new party is basically surrendering yourself to the stupidity that we have had to endure as a movement for the last few years. None of these parties are really parties. I hate to say that. And if I were to form a new party, I would just be perpetuating the delusions that the socialist movement has. We need to get serious. None of these parties are a real party. Someday there will be a real party, right? Someday a real party will come along. And you know why? You know how I'll know it's a real party? I will know it's a real party because they will approach me. And they will not approach me with, you better stop doing that because we're the real socialists, which is how that's the approach I'm mainly getting from the parties right now. Well, you all should, dissolve and join us if you're serious. Then you're not a real party. But at some point, a party will approach me, the way Chavez approached the various socialist groups of Venezuela and said, hey, I'm trying to really get this done. You want to join my efforts? Can we find a way to combine our efforts? They'll approach me the way the Bolsheviks approached Trotsky in July of 1917 and said, hey, we know you have these long disagreements with Lenin, but you're against the war and we're against the war. And, that's how they'll approach me. A real party will approach me as a potential ally. Will approach me as, hey, we might not agree with you on everything, but you are doing work and you've got people listening to you and we're doing this and we got people listening to you and maybe we should try to see how we can work in mutual benefit. When a party approaches me like that, not as the competitor, not as somebody they need to outdo, not as somebody they need to show that that they're the real party and he's a phone, but if they approach me as a potential ally, right? If someone approaches, if they will approach people like me as a potential ally, not as a competitor, then I'll know they're serious, right? And none of the communist groups function that way. The way the communist groups in the United States function, they all have the one true party theory. They are the one true party. They are the one true party. All the other parties are fake, and it's just silly. It's silly and it's a charade. But eventually there will be folks that are serious that will come along. And we have the same approach to the masses, the anti-patriotism, right? There's millions of Americans who are patriotic. If you're going to be a serious political force in the country, do you want to alienate all of those people? Well, according to all the internet people, yes, you do, right? Because anyone who's patriotic is a racist. And all right, you're not serious. Bye-bye, right? What about Christianity, right? Millions of Americans are Christians, right? Or millions of Americans are Jewish or Muslim or believe in God, have a religion, right? Are you going to make enemies out of all of those Americans? Well, if you're serious, you won't. But if you're not serious, yeah, you'll go, oh, anyone who believes in God is not a true communist, and you'll alienate all those people. But if you're serious, You'll find a way to get Americans who are patriotic to vote for you, to get Americans who are religious to vote for you. You'll find a way to get socialists with a different interpretation of socialism to align with you and support you if you're serious. That's what serious people do. Serious people try to make alliances. And LARPers try to make enemies. Because that's the game, right? If you can denounce, I denounce, right? If you can make a big show of denouncing somebody, you waved an American flag. Well, I am more revolutionary than you. I think America is evil. Look at me. Look how revolutionary I am. You published a book, Jesus is a Socialist. Well, I hate Christianity. I think all Christians are Nazis. Look how revolutionary I am. I am so revolutionary. Well, then you're not serious. I can tell you're not serious. You are trying to make enemies out of all the working people that are patriotic. You're not serious. You're trying to make enemies out of all the working people that are Christians. You're not serious. If you see every other socialist group in the United States, not as a potential friend, but as somebody you immediately want to find out how you can expose them and how you can find a difference with them, you're not serious. You're not serious. And that's the way the socialist movement is. That's why I'm saying out of the movement and to the masses. And if I were to form a new party, that would put me in the movement, and it would immediately cut me off from the masses. I would become just another one of the alphabet soup, competing with all the other alphabet soup about who's the biggest LARPer in the protest cage. And I'm done with that. I'm really done with that. On top of that, my job does have a rule. It is a rule of my job. It is actually one of the rules of my job that you are not allowed to be a member of a political party in order to be at my job. So even if I wanted to form a political party, I could not. It would be in violation of the place that I work, the company I work for, right? You can't be in a political party. So I am not going to be forming a new political party. I know there's people that are insisting that that's not true, right? There's people going around who, no, it's a pre-party formation. No, it's only a matter. Well, it ain't a pre-party formation. I am not forming a party. I'm 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 not forming a party. I am forming a think tank. I am engaging in a socialist education project, and you're welcome to join me. And if you don't want to join me, don't. I'm not making you join me. That's what I don't understand. I have never understood this, right? If you don't like what I do, don't participate. It's that easy. I'm not asking you to participate. And in fact, I'm not even necessarily going around and saying you're a phony, you're a fake. The way I see it, the socialist movement is a lot like an orchestra. It's a lot like an orchestra. I've given this speech before, but I will give it again. Right? In an orchestra, you have a bassoon, you have a trombone, you have a trumpet, you have a drum, you have a violin. And in order to have an orchestra, you have to have all of those things. And they all play together, playing their different instruments, playing their different parts, and they make beautiful music. An effective communist movement that would, a real party that was actually going to take power, not one of these silly alphabet soup groups, but a real party that was going to take power would be like an orchestra. There would be some people in that group that would run for office and would campaign for candidates. There would be some people in that group that would go around giving classes on Marxist theory. That group would have a newspaper. That group would have people in the labor union movement. That group would print books. That group would have unemployment councils and associations. That group would have people who organized for racial justice. That group would have people who organized around women's rights. That group would have people that protested against the wars and organized demonstrations. That group would have youth organizations. That group would have ethnic associations of different nationalities. That group would have religious affiliates. It would have all kinds of things. And they would all be working in coordination, doing their different role, playing their different part, all to make socialism come to the United States. That's not what we have now in the socialist movement. We have a bunch of little tiny groups that all do one thing. We have some groups that work in the labor movement. We have some groups that campaign and get people elected. We have some groups that sell books or publish their newspapers. We have some groups that reserve permits and have protests. And instead of trying, to work with they all walk around acting as if All the other groups are not doing the right thing. The only thing that anyone should be doing is what their group is doing. The groups that print books walk around and say, "Oh, well, you might organize a protest, but we print books." And the groups that campaign for the Democrats say, "Oh, well, I guess you're screaming out in the streets, but we're campaigning for the Democrats and we're getting people elected." And the groups that and it's silly. It's silliness, right? It is absolutely silly because a real party would do what every communist group in the United States is doing in terms of activism and so much more, and they would get to the broad masses of people and they would create the beautiful music of leading the country towards socialism. But they're not doing that right now. They're not doing that right now. None of the socialist groups are doing that. And they all have about one thing that they could do well, and then they accuse they accuse all the other groups of being fake for not doing it. And that's not my approach. And I know that the task that I am taking on is not the only thing people should do. We need people to organize protests in the streets. We need people to organize demonstrations and reserve permits in Washington, D.C. We need people to do that. We need people to work in labor unions, right? We need people to work in labor unions. We need people to run for office and get elected. We need people to build, relationships with elected officials. And so we need all of that. But what I can do is socialist education. That's what I do every night on these streams, practically. That's what I do with the books I write. That's what I do, and so I'm forming the Center for Political Innovation to engage in socialist education. This is the task that I can take on, that I'm willing to do, and I don't have the illusion that it's the only thing anyone should ever be doing. That's not my illusion. I don't sit there and go, "Oh, all these other people, because they're not doing what I'm doing, are phony." No, in fact, I hope that there are people in the labor unions who read my material, listen to my broadcasts, watch what the Center for Political Innovation does, and help it guide them in their labor activism. I hope that there are people who are watching these broadcasts who are involved in anti-war protests, and because they're involved in these anti-war protests, they're guided by the material that I put. I hope that that's the case. I hope there are other. I mean, I hope that the political education that I do will help other people do all kinds of different activism, right? So I am coming to terms. It's really interesting when you want to get all Freudian here. When a baby is first born, a baby thinks it is the most powerful thing in the world. Did you know that? A baby thinks it is amazingly powerful because all that baby has to do is go wah and cry, and it immediately gets food and immediately gets taken care of. And part of growing up is realizing your own weakness, right? I mean, that's actually the reality of it. Is that as you grow up, you start to realize, oh, I am not powerful, right? And especially when you're like a teenager, when you're a young man, you think, well, I'm full of energy, I'm full of strength. If I could just go out there, and as you grow up, you start to realize, no, you become more aware of what you are capable of doing and what you are not capable of doing. Right, and that's part of being a mature adult. You don't have unrealistic expectations of what you can achieve. Right, you make, and that's one thing a lot of people struggle with. I know a lot of people who make plans that are not ever going to be implemented, and it drives me crazy because my life consists of making plans in a very realistic way and implementing them. And when I sit there with people and I talk with them and they make plans and they say, "Oh, let's do this," and I'll be like, "Okay, well, I want to do that, but here's and I try to, and they get frustrated with me. And I'm like, "No, I want your plan to work, but I want to make it actually work." When I am making a plan, I'm constantly thinking, how can I make it actually happen? That is what I'm constantly thinking. And I'm constantly trying to get my expectations to be realistic because I want them to be fulfilled. Right? And that's one weakness I see. A lot of people that have brilliant ideas, that are very well read, they develop plans or visions that aren't realistic, and they never then try to implement them. And they think of it, it's like a daydreaming process that they develop, where it's just like they're not really making plans because they want to actually fulfill them. It's just kind of an intellectual exercise they do in their head. It's like, let's make this plan that will entertain me for the day. Let's make a plan that will entertain me for the afternoon. No, let's make a plan. Let's make a serious plan and do it. And the Center for Political Innovation, we planned to have our retreat, where we did the Saxton lectures. And we did it. And we planned our California event, and we did it. And we planned to form the John Brown Volunteer Outreach Team, and we did it. We planned the Nicaragua, the Nicaragua delegation, and unless I test positive for COVID or they don't let us on the plane or whatever, we're going to do it, right? We're set to go to Nicaragua, right? We make realistic plans and we carry them out. And in order to make realistic plans, you must have a realistic assessment of your own abilities, right? And that's part of becoming a mature person, is realizing I am capable of this, I am not capable of this, and within your own capabilities, pushing yourself to achieve the best you can. Something everyone struggles with, and it's a very difficult thing. There are some people that have so much ability and don't have any confidence in themselves, right? And they just sit around and they think, I can't, right? Every time they start to do something, they get this voice in their head that says, I can't, right? They have this evil voice in their head. It's probably the voice of an abusive parent or an abusive older brother or somebody who just bullied them and said, you can't, you won't be able to do it, you're going to fail, right? And that voice is toxic, right? And that holds people back. So some people just never make serious plans because of that, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, right, there are some people who are very good at kind of daydreaming these plans, but they don't understand how to put them into practice. Well, what I struggle to do, and what we need to do if we actually want to build a Center for Political Innovation, is make realistic plans and carry them out. And we have been doing that. And we continue to do that. And we are figuring out what realistic plans to make. What can we do in our real life? In our real life, what can we do, right? What can we do in our real life and then carry it out and then achieve it, right? And that is being realistic, right? And that is functioning in the real world. And a lot of these communist groups that, can barely, get the leaflets together to hand out at the rally, they sit around and talk about, well, when we come to power, after the revolution, and it's like, it's sad. I used to joke, there's a certain communist group that will not be named. They actually published the Constitution of the Socialist Republic of North America after the revolution. And I looked at that and I just thought, that's sad. And I joke that, they've got the whole after the revolution part down. It's the whole making the revolution thing they're not so good at. It's sad. It's just like, okay, right. So after the revolution, you already got the Constitution written. Thank goodness, right? After you overthrow capitalism and you establish socialism, you're going to sit there and you're going to, oh shit, we have to write a Constitution. Thank God we did it back in 2012. Thank goodness. Oh, we're cleared. Oh boy. Give me a break. This is just silliness. It's just silliness. When is it time when is the time right for the Socialist Party or the Vanguard Party or a mass party? All of the above. All of the above right now. Right now, again, what I can do is engage in socialist education. And you're welcome to do it with me. And if you don't like what I'm doing, then do something else. And that's what I really don't understand. These people that don't do very much on their own or are doing other things, why is what I'm doing bothering them? If you don't like what I'm doing, make your own YouTube channel. If you don't like the books I write your own books. You don't like the conferences I hold your own conferences. If you don't like the outreach that the John Brown Volunteers do outreach yourself. I really don't get the people who just sit there and it's like, well, I just drive them crazy. And it's like, there are such people. I know a number of them, and I just drive them crazy. And it's like, why? And it's like, I feel like on some level they must be aware of their own, they must realize, like, they must feel like they wish they were doing some more. And so, by attacking me for doing what I do, it kind of like makes them feel better or something, because it's weird. I really don't get it. You don't like what I'm doing, do it yourself. All right. All right. American socialists, who first visited the USSR, what were their reactions? That's a very good question. And one of the most famous ones is the journalist Lincoln Steffens. I don't know if you ever heard this before, but Lincoln Steffens was an American muckraker journalist who exposed the crimes of big business. And when he came to the Soviet Union, he came back, and the journalists met him at the airport. Mr. Lincoln Steffens, what did you see in the Soviet Union? He said, I've seen the future, and it works. And that was a very famous quotation. He said, I've seen the future and it works. And they actually made a song by Prince. I've seen the future and it works. Right? I think it's from the Batman movie or something, right? But it's funny, I didn't know that was a quote from Lincoln Steffens. I heard that on the Batman soundtrack when I was a kid. I got the cassette tape from the library. It had Batman on it. And, I've seen the future and it works. And actually, that's Prince, and that was Prince alluding to the Soviet Union. I've seen the future, and it works. But the first years after the Russian Revolution were very difficult. You want to read, Anna Louise Strong, a journalist, a writer that I really like. Anna Louise Strong, she visited the Soviet Union, and she wrote, the first book she wrote about the Soviet Union was called The First Time in History. And it's very beautiful. And she writes about the Soviet Union and what it's like. It's a very powerful book. I think it's online. You can read it. And she describes the conditions in Russia immediately after the revolution. There's a very good book called 6 Months in Red Russia. 6 Months in Red Russia, and it's by Louise Bryant. Louise Bryant was the partner of John Reed. And she wrote 6 Months in Red Russia. And it's very beautiful. It's very readable. 6 Months in Red Russia. I really recommend it. That's a very good book if you want to know about the Russian Revolution. John Reed, his book, 10 Days That Shook the World, is not, I didn't get very much out of that book, I'll be honest. But 6 Months in Red Russia by Louise Brandt, his partner, is very good. Very, very good. I really liked that. And a lot of personal stories of various Russian revolutionaries and such. Very good stuff. So there you go. Favorite New York City pizza place? Patsy's. Patsy's. There's a pizza shop in my neighborhood where I'll go and buy, just slices because they're cheap. But if I'm going to, sit down and have a whole pizza, have a whole meal, I go to Patsy's. That's where I go. Patsy's Pizzeria. So there you go. All right. And I guess Patsy's and this other place, they have a competition for who makes the best, who invented the pizza, right? And I guess they both claim that they're the true inheritors of inventing the pizza or something like that. I'm not an expert on that kind of thing, but yeah, there's a Patsy's I go to near my job sometimes. Occasionally there'll be a nice afternoon where I don't have to do that much. I'll sneak on over to Patsy's and I'll sit there and I'll order a small pie with pepperoni, and I will sit there and eat, and it's very peaceful. All right, what is my theory of truth? I mean, what? I don't even know how to answer that. What is my theory of truth? There is only one lie. There is only one truth. There is the lie of revisionism and opportunism of all hues, the lie of imperialism and reaction, and there is the truth of Marxism, Leninism, of revolution and socialism. Well, actually, that's a song by Cornelius Cardew. I was just kind of singing it ironically. You can look it up. It's called There Is Only One Lie, There Is Only One Truth by Cornelius Cardew, the Enver Hoxha Marxist composer. But I don't know what the person was asking about. What is my theory of truth? I do believe in objective reality. Objective reality, I do believe that truth does exist. I tend to, adhere basically to dialectical materialism. There are some beliefs I do have that are somewhat idealist. I do believe in God, for example. But for the most part, I lean toward the dialectical materialist worldview. All that exists is matter, but that matter is constantly in motion. So there you go. Why would the CIA, the Mafia, and the military oppose JFK? Well, JFK, he very much was of the school of thought that the big wars like the Korean War hurt the image of the United States, and that the best approach, the best approach to dealing with the Soviet Union, was like détente, was negotiating with them. He was not excited about escalating the Vietnam War. And on top of that, he aligned himself with the civil rights movement. So there you go. The original Patsy's was in Vito Marcantonio's district. Oh, Vito Marcantonio. We'll talk about that. All right. Vito Marcantonio. That's a good question. Um, if you could travel back in time, where would you travel to? If you could travel back in time. So there you go. All right. Alrighty. All right. But JFK, he wanted to make the moon mission, the effort to reach the moon, a combined effort. He wanted the Soviet Union and the United States to combine their efforts to go to the moon. That was a huge threat to the military-industrial complex. He didn't want to escalate the Vietnam War, and he aligned himself with the civil rights movement. He arranged for there to be national civil rights marches in Washington D.C., and there was a fear that he could become another Roosevelt. More than anything, I mean, that was the fear, is that he could become another Roosevelt, I think, and that he was from that Eastern establishment. He favored soft power, and the military especially considered him to be a threat. Marxism in South America before Chavez. Well, okay, so you have to remember that, again, in my live, I was talking about Myanmar. I was talking about Myanmar and how there was a military junta there, which the USA liked and now doesn't like, right? And that shift happened in South America. In the 70s and 80s, the main way communists in South America operated was they went into the countryside and they did the Che Guevara thing. They had armed rebel groups in the countryside. Why? Because most of these countries were brutal military dictatorships, where if you were just handing out leaflets on the street as a communist in a city, you got arrested and dragged away and never heard from again. In Pinochet's Chile, you couldn't be openly a communist. In most of the cities, and in Venezuela, people were disappeared, and you couldn't operate in the cities. So the communists went into the countryside to wage guerrilla warfare, and it worked in Nicaragua. It worked in Cuba. It worked. In some countries, there were moderate successes, right? Where they were able to have socialist revolutions. Communists were basically, they were college kids and they operated very secretly on the universities and stuff, and they would recruit, college students basically, and then they would go to the countryside and start carving out liberated territory and trying to build a liberation army among the peasantry. And sometimes, it often didn't work, but in some cases it did. But they had to do that because they couldn't organize publicly, right? Because of the fact that there was, at that point, there was a brutal authoritarian states. But in the 1990s, the open society model of George Soros and the Open Society Institute, and they had the opposite approach. And the U.S. imperialists wanted neoliberalism, and they wanted governments. They didn't want strong military juntas to hold off the threat of communism. Instead, what they wanted was open societies, governments that were so weak they had no chance of standing up or putting economic protections. They didn't have to take care of anybody, and they wanted open societies. And so the fight against neoliberalism in urban centers shifted. In the 1990s, communist groups shifted the way they operated. They stopped operating in rural areas trying to wage guerrilla warfare, and they moved to the cities and they started organizing popular fronts against imperialism and against austerity. And that was how, you'll notice, that's how Bolivarianism emerged. There was a tactical shift. So there you go. All right, that's a very important point. And that Chavez was the first major victory of that tactical shift. You had the water fights in Bolivia. In Bolivia there were all kinds of working class revolts. And then you had the rise of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and then Evo Morales, and there was a popular front that was formed against austerity and cutbacks in social spending. Keep the super chats coming, folks. I will answer your questions as they come in. So, would I ever go on Tucker Carlson? 100% I would. Absolutely, if I had the opportunity. With my job situation and with other aspects of my life, I may not be able to, but if I was in a situation where I had that opportunity, yes, I would do it. The answer is yes. Next question. All right. would CPI reach out to members of other religions? Of course. CPI has members of other religions in it. There are Muslims who are members of CPI. There are Jews that are members of CPI. There are atheists, a number of atheists who are in the CPI. We are not a Christian organization. There are Christians in it, like myself, like Keaton Mansfield. We did publish a book directed at Christians, but we are not a religious organization. We are religiously neutral. We are religiously neutral. We have no position on religion. We are open to members of all faiths and people of no faith. And I want to be absolutely clear about that. There needs to be no confusion on that point whatsoever. All right, next question. Next question. Vito Marcantonio. Vito Marcantonio was the member, right? Okay. What was the Popular Front? All right. Popular Front. All right. Very good question. All right. Vito Marcantonio was a member of Congress. He represented Harlem in Congress during the 1930s. He was originally a Republican because he was at odds with the Tammany Hall machine. In New York City, the Democrats were the ruling party, the party of Tammany Hall. So Republicans often were more left-wing, than the Democrats in New York City because they were at odds with the city establishment. Historically, it was very odd, but he was originally a Republican, and then he became a member of Congress, and then he started the American Labor Party, it was called, and that was the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, some other groups, labor unions, and they got him elected to Congress. But he was considered to be a Communist Party friend. He was part of the fraternal organization that the Communist Party had called the International Workers' Order, which was like a fraternity that had like social insurance and stuff. He was part of the IWO, it was called, the International Workers' Order, and he took the Communist Party line on things generally. He supported the 1939 pact. He put up anti-lynching bills to stop lynching in the South, to support African Americans. Vito Marcantonio was a real hero of the working class. He was an Italian American, and he was a communist. He wasn't a Communist Party member, but he was very close to the Communist Party. He was seen as their ally in Congress. And there was somebody in Minnesota who was like that, who actually did finally join the party later in the 60s, but he was in Congress in Minnesota. He was a House of Representatives member in Minnesota who used to read articles from the Daily Worker into the Congressional Record. But Vito Marcantonio, I have a series of speeches that he gave. There's a book of his speeches. It's called I Vote My Conscience. And all of them are just speeches that Vito Marcantonio gave before Congress, just the transcript. And you read it. These are revolutionary working class speeches. Vito Marcantonio was a fighter for the working class. He was a socialist. He was he's from Harlem. And then during World War II, not only was Vito Marcantonio in Congress, but representing Harlem, but you also had Peter Cashoni, another Italian American who was in City Council of New York City, and then you had Benjamin Davis, who was an African American who was also in City Council. And so you had the two City Council seats of Harlem were occupied by Communist Party members. And then you had at that point you had the congressional seat was held of the American Labor Party, Vito Marcantonio, who was considered to be like a friend and fellow traveler of the Communist Party. That's how influential the Communist Party was back in the day. That's why the Communist Party is worth studying. William Z. Foster was a serious leader of a real organization. Study him. The Black Panthers, right? That was a real organization with real influence. So study them. But these other groups that are tiny and irrelevant and are fighting with all the other groups, they're not worth studying, right? But study groups that actually got something done. Study Bolivarian socialism. Study Ba'athist Arab socialism. Study the Chinese Communist Party, right? Study the Black Panthers. Study the Communist Party USA from the 1930s. But don't, these groups that are just yelling at each other and sectarian are not worth your time. I study people who actually get stuff done, right? That's what we should be studying. People who got stuff done. We should figure out how they got what they got done, how they got it done, number one, what they could have done better, what were their strengths, what were their weaknesses, how they got done what they did get done, etc. Rapid increase in anti-China thought. All right. So there you go. If I could go back in time, when would I go back in time? You know, at risk of being a party pooper, I would just have to be honest with you and say, if I could go back in time, I wouldn't. I wouldn't, because every event, I've often had this. This is very similar to, right? Why not change the name of the Perfective United Socialist States of America to the United Socialists of America? Huh? Against the liberal insanity of DSA. I don't even. Oh, United Socialists of America. All right. Okay, writing it down. But I often get questions. People ask, well, what if this had happened? Right? I often get questions like that. People, well, what if, how could the Soviet Union not have fallen? That question I've been asked many times on here. How could the Soviet Union not have fallen? That's one question I get. You know, what if the Communist Party in the 30s had done this differently? What if this had happened? And I can't go there. I just can't go there because it's the butterfly effect. The more you really study history, the more you really study history and the more you dig into your own life, the more you realize that you can't do this, right? I've sat there before and I've been like, oh, if I had only made this decision, what could have happened? The more I think about it, the more I realize I wasn't going to make that decision. Because every decision I made because of the unique circumstances I was in. And I made it because of, you know, where I was at the time, the conditions I was in. I made the decisions I made because of the circumstances I was in. I was going to make those decisions. And so it's like when you look back on history, like what if the Communist Party had done this? Well, they weren't going to do that. Right? There's a famous short story about, like, you know, somebody who goes back in time and they step on a butterfly. They step on a butterfly and it changes like the course of an election or something. That's true. Like every event is tied up with an incalculable other amount of other events. Um, and so you can't, you know, you can't go back in history and say, oh, if this would change. No, because there's so many things attached to that event. And then you also can't go back in your own life. If I'd have made this decision differently, no, you wouldn't have made that decision differently because you made the decision that you made. You made the decision that you made, and you weren't going to just make another decision. You know, there's random events like car accidents. Like if that car accident hadn't have happened, well, there's a reason that car accident happened. That car accident not happening would have required so many other things to change that, you know, you can't do that. You know, and when you get caught up in that kind of thinking, it's a trap. Right? Again, it's a trap that you get into. It's like, and it's one of those rabbit holes people get stuck in. Kind of like people who sit there and make these very elaborate plans they never plan to carry out, or people that are incapable of making plans because they have this bully voice in their head that, like, it spits on their plans and degrades them. Right? This is another trap people get in. If only I had worn the blue suit instead of the gray suit. If only I had gotten the don't. That's not how it works. It doesn't work that way, right? You can't get into this. And with history, the more you study history, the more you realize events happened the way they happened for so many reasons. There are so many factors that contribute to these events happening that you can't say, well, what if it had happened differently? Because that would require so many other things to be different. And then all of those things being different require so many other things to be different. You can't do that, right? You can't change history. You can't make hypotheticals about what would have happened. You can't do that. It doesn't really work. The more you understand, the more you dig into these things, right? The more you start to realize you can't do this. So I don't, you know, if I could travel back in time, I wouldn't, because I wouldn't even know what I would. I mean, okay, so if I could travel back in time to history and I could change the outcome of what, right? You know, I mean, the amount of change that would result from that would be so vast that I mean, there you go. So there you go. I just don't even entertain questions like that because it's just you can't at the end of the day. You can try to make the best decision, right? That's one thing you can do, is try to make the best decision. Try to, you know, weigh the possible outcomes of what you can do. Try to make sure you're treating other people fairly. You know, try to show respect for other people. But at the end of the day, you can't get into, well, what if this, what if that? You know, you make a bad choice. At some point, you learn from it. And then you make a better choice. But there you go. All right. What was the Popular Front? Well, the Popular Front was this. Okay, so you know, All right. So let me back up. All right. So we have to understand the Communist International. In the 19, what year was it? In 19, what year? What 19? What year? 1921, I think they formed the Communist International, right? And so the communists of the world were oriented to form new parties that were aligned with the Soviet Union, that adopted the 21 points. Lenin had these 21 points, and if you agreed with those 21 points, you could join the Communist International. And those parties were oriented to try and form united fronts with socialist parties. The idea was that the Social Democrats and the communists and the anarchists and the labor unions, the whole working class movement, to organize for different things they could agree on, right? And the idea was that communists should try to form united fronts. And, communists should work in non-communist labor unions. Communists should, coordinate with the Socialist Party to free political prisoners, to, create an 8-hour workday, to have better protections for workers on the job, that communists should lead united fronts. So, in response to the efforts of communists to build united fronts, the Social Democrats of the world, of the Western world, of Germany, France, Britain, the United States, went crazy. The American Federation of Labor banned any communists from joining the American Federation of Labor. And the Socialist Party of the United States and the German Social Democratic Party, they said our main enemy is on the left. And they started to argue that the main threat to socialism was the Soviet Union because it was so, it would hurt the image of socialism. And so the Social Democrats went on like an anti-communist spree. And in Germany, they killed some communists. There were various times that Social Democrats actually murdered communists. And in the United States, they were working with like the FBI to help purge communists from the labor movement and such. So in response to that, in 1928, the communists saw the Great Depression coming. They understood all the signs were there. The global economy was going to crash. So in 1928, they had the 6th World Congress of the Communist International. And at the 6th World Congress of the Communist International, the communists announced that they were in the third period. First, after the Russian Revolution, there'd been a period of uprisings around the world. And then there was the 1920s, the Roaring '20s was a period of capitalist stabilization. And then 1928 marked the beginning of the third period, which was going to be the period of revolution. And they had the slogan of class against class. And that was 1928, the 6th World Congress, class against class, the third period. And at that point, the communists declared that social democrats were their enemies, and they called social democrats social fascists. And their primary focus was combating the social democrats and exposing the social democrats as agents of capitalism and not of holding back the revolution. Then, however, Hitler came to power in Germany, and fascist movements started expanding around the world. And in response to the rise of fascism, they had another World Congress. They had the 7th World Congress of 1935. In 1935, they had the 7th World Congress of the Communist International. And at the 7th World Congress, they changed their orientation. And they, instead of arguing that social democrats were the enemy, they said, no, now communists need to focus on building a united front against fascism, and eventually to build a people's front against fascism. And this people's front against fascism, or popular front against fascism, people's front against fascism, would include social democrats, would include liberals, would include anybody who was against fascism. And the idea was that capitalism is naturally moving toward fascism. So it is necessary, with capitalism naturally moving toward fascism, for communists to fight fascism. Because communists are the only ones who really understand why society is moving toward fascism. And because of that, communists are really the only ones that are capable of leading an effective fight against fascism. And if you want to read the logic of the Popular Front, you should read Georgy Dimitrov's pamphlet. Georgy Dimitrov was the leader of the Communist International, and he gave a very long speech explaining the new tactical orientation of building the United Front against fascism, which came to be known as the People's Front. And that's what the Popular Front theory is, that basically capitalism needs fascism in order to stay in power. So communists have to build a broad, united anti-fascist front. and that will lead to them taking power. And it worked. It was very successful. It was very successful. And the Second World War happened, and all of Eastern Europe had communist revolutions. And in China, the Japanese fascists invaded, and pretty soon you had communist China. In Yugoslavia, they drove out the fascists, and and the communists came to power. And in Albania, they drove out the fascists, and the communists came to power. It was a very effective tactic. Now, there were places where, people look into it, like in India, for example, or in Syria, and there were places where they look at it and they say, well, it wasn't as successful. Right? In Syria, for example, because France was the colonizer and France was not a fascist country, the Communist Party of Syria said we can't oppose French colonialism. Well, a lot of Syrians who wanted their independence and opposed French colonialism quit the Communist Party, and that's where the Ba'ath Party comes from. The Ba'ath Party were Syrians who didn't want to support French colonialism because that was part of the Popular Front. In India, in India, the British were the colonizer, and the British were anti-fascist. So a lot of Indian communists said we can't oppose the British because we're aligning with them against fascism. So there were some breakaways from the Communist Party that formed, and some of the main Indian resistance groups became sympathetic to fascism for that reason, because they were against the British. The British were their colonizer. There were Kenyan groups that were aligned with the communists, but because the British, Kenya was occupied by Britain, was colonized by Britain, because of that, they quit being communists and they sent delegations and got guns from Hitler and stuff like that. In Ireland, the IRA, the communists were all kicked out of the IRA because the communists said we got to stop fighting the British and focus on defeating fascism. So the Popular Front was overwhelmingly successful. It was communists became the most effective anti-fascist fighters, and they defeated Hitler during World War II, and they liberated countries, and they led the resistance, in France, and they, and they formed the partisan brigades in Italy that fought the Nazis, and they did amazing stuff. The Popular Front was one of the most amazing periods in communist history. But there were also defeats. In Spain, the Popular Front failed. The Popular Front failed to defeat Franco. In other countries, the Popular Front was not successful. But again, Trotskyites want to sit there and do this game. This whole thing I was just condemning there before about, if only this had happened. That's what Trotskyism is. Trotskyism is premised on, if only they had listened to Trotsky, there would have been success in Spain. No. If only they had listened to Trotsky, Hitler wouldn't have come to power in Germany. No. If only they had listened to Trotsky, World War II would never have happened. No. No, 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 no. You can't do that, right? And again, the Popular Front was successful in many countries, many countries. That tactic of building an anti-fascist united front was amazingly successful. In all across Eastern Europe, it worked. In Italy, it was very successful. The Communist Party gained huge amounts of support. In Albania, it brought the communists to power. In Yugoslavia, it brought the communists to power. In China, it brought the communists to power. In Korea, it brought the communists to power. In many countries, the Popular Front was very, very, very effective, okay? But there were instances where it wasn't as effective, like Syria, like India, etc. So it's complicated. But overwhelmingly, the Popular Front, if anything, we should learn from. We should learn from the Popular Front, because that was a period where the communists had probably the most influence they ever had. In terms of the global communist movement, that moment where there was World War II, in the lead up to World War II, and then in World War II itself, when the world was fighting against fascism, communists were on fire, and they were leading the fight against fascism. And that's why after World War II, communism spread all over the world. You had the Cuban Revolution, you had the Korean Revolution, you had many African countries moving toward communism, you had the rise of Arab socialism. It was because coming out of World War II, the communists had kicked ass in World War II. They had kicked ass in World War II. And why had they kicked ass so hard in World War II? Because Nazism is illiberal, and you can't defeat illiberalism with liberalism, right? You need communist illiberalism to fight fascist illiberalism. You cannot defeat liberalism with illiberalism. Or, I'm sorry, you cannot defeat illiberalism with liberalism. As I just pointed out earlier in this stream, you need illiberalism to fight illiberalism. The status quo, there is no truth, everything's a matter of opinion, will never defeat fascism. Only communism can defeat fascism. You need another form of illiberalism to defeat fascist illiberalism. When capitalist society, the liberal order, collapses into illiberalism, the only thing that can cure that is communism. You can't cure it with, oh, let's just go back to the status quo as we were before. Nope, doesn't work that way, right? And we're preparing for liberalism to collapse in the United States. It's only a matter of time before liberalism ultimately collapses in America. And when that happens, the only thing that will be able to save us will be socialism. You won't be able to just fight it with more liberalism. It won't work. So there you go. There you go. And that's a scary thought. And that's something that keeps me up awake at night. Because I know, enjoy Biden while he lasts. Enjoy Biden while he lasts. Because, there are some scary things waiting for us. I'm not a huge fan of Biden, but enjoy it while it lasts. Because, unless a real working class movement emerges very quickly, we're going to get Kamala Harris, we're going to get Trump 2.0, and it's going to be scary. And, we need, enjoy this liberal thaw while you got it. We can get good work done now. That's what we can do. Biden is an awful president. He's doing awful policies. He's not going to save the country. But things are open right now. And they may not be very open for very long right now. Give it time. Give it 2-3 years. Give it 5 years. I give it about 5 years. 5 years, and we won't be able to organize like we're organizing right now. There'll be much, the political climate and the authoritarianism will be much stricter. So there you go. Rapid increase in anti-China, propaganda in the United States. Well, that's because of the fact that the pandemic happened and China's economy kept speeding ahead because they're socialist, and our economy crashed and burned because we're dedicated to the rule of profits. And so now Trump's policy was to focus on China. And now we're at the point where the Democrats have adopted that policy as well. And that's one thing that's interesting, right? People kept saying that Trump's foreign policy, it was, Trump had foreign policy differences. You'll notice the Biden administration has basically continued all of that, right? The Biden administration has not moved the U.S. embassy out of Jerusalem. The Biden administration has not, de-escalated with China. They haven't. A lot of Trump's foreign policy moves are still in effect, right? They said Trump was softer on Russia, but then Biden had that Putin summit, and, he seemed to be getting along with Russia. I'm not seeing big foreign policy differences here. There's rhetoric. There's certainly, difference in rhetoric. But there you go, Steve Donziger. So there you go. All right. Why not call the party the United Socialists of America as USA? I don't know. Again, that's a great idea. Maybe you should form that. But the United Socialists of America. The Socialists of America are not united. They're not united at this point. I hate to break it to you. But if somebody wanted to form a group with that name, it's a great name. So there you go. And thank you for the super chat, Chancellor. But there you go. All right. All right. The next question is about Steve Donziger. Is he the guy that ExxonMobil went after? He was exposing big oil, and so they put him in jail. Is that who that is? That name sounds familiar. Is he is that the case of big oil put him in jail? Right? Is that who that guy is? Yeah. Look into that. Oh, it was Chevron. He basically was suing Chevron, and they retaliated against him. It's pretty unbelievable. Look in the details of that case. It's terrifying. It's utterly terrifying. Look into the details of that case. I was reading about that case, and I was just like, this is utterly terrifying. Utterly terrifying to see how much power the capitalists have. It's utterly terrifying to read about. Scary stuff. Absolutely scary stuff. But there you go. There you go. All right. Are there any other super chat questions before we go? Now would be the time to send them because at this point we're starting to head toward wrapping up. So if there's any other last questions, now is the time. Now is the time while I drink my unnamed water beverage. All right. Sergio Moro recently spoke at the University of Chicago Law School about fighting corruption in Latin America and stated that Lula got off on a technicality. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Lula got railroaded on a technicality. That is unbelievable. That is infuriating, right? If you look at the details of how Lula da Silva was sent to prison, it was a frame up and it was to prevent him from running in the elections. Bolsonaro would not be president right now if they hadn't railroaded Lula da Silva to prison in order to keep him from being president of Brazil. That is a fact. The tweets, the text messages between the prosecutor and the judge are now public, right? They were leaked to the public. It was a rigged trial. I mean, and the people that were going after, they talk about the car wash scandal, the people that jailed Lula da Silva for corruption, the people that impeached Dilma Rousseff were far more corrupt than they are. And this is how dangerous this corruption narrative is. The Panama Papers, they've gone after Isabel dos Santos, they've gone after Alex Saab, and this corruption stuff. Look, I'll tell you what the corruption is. The corruption is the world is run by billionaire monopoly capitalists who get their will. It's basically, if I have a corrupt file on my computer, what does that mean? Does that mean the file's taking bribes from me? No, that means it's not working the way it's supposed to. That's what corruption is, right? It's when stuff isn't working the way it's supposed to. And if you look at it, that's basically the assumption, right? Politicians in Brazil are just supposed to de facto serve American corporations, right? The state-run oil company in Angola is just supposed to de facto do what American oil companies want it to do, and work with them and be a middleman for them, right? This is the same way they talk about democratic regression. It's the same narrative, where it's like, in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez was popular, but he tampered with independent institutions like the courts and the police and the business sector. So even though he was elected, the fact that he changed society once he was elected means he was a dictator, because it's supposed to be independent. Well, by independent, they mean serving the United States, serving capitalism. He got elected and changed them. And so suddenly, when they're not just doing what they're supposed to do, serving capitalism, serving imperialism, all of a sudden they've lost their independence and he must be a dictator, even if he's elected, right? This is the way they like to talk about things, right? If socialist countries do anything, it's corruption, right? It's unbelievable. And the Panama Papers and all this stuff about corruption, it's a way that they attack anti-imperialists, right? It's like, do you think that the president of a country is not going to live a comfortable life? Do you think that look at the Joe Biden family, right? Hunter Biden, okay? Look at the Trump family. Look at how Trump enriched himself throughout his presidency. Come on. View on COVID vaccine available in the USA and China. China's got a vaccine. USA has a vaccine. I don't know what's the deal? I'm not against the vaccines. I'm sorry, but do you think that politicians in anti-imperialist states don't live comfortable lives? Of course they do. Right? They do, right? And I don't deny that. And we've talked on here about bureaucracy in socialist states. When you have a shortage of food, somebody's going to have to regulate, how things are distributed. And they're going to want a bigger slice of bread than everybody else gets because they're taking on that responsibility. And that this is a problem, in Zimbabwe, right? It was a black government because they overthrew the white apartheid state, and it was led by Robert Mugabe. It was a government for the black people, for the African people. But prior to the overthrow of the settler colonial state of Rhodesia, most black people didn't have access to education. So in this black government led by black people, by the African people, they had to hire a lot of white people, white Rhodesians, from the apartheid, government. They're the ones that had the education and had all the government bureaucratic jobs. And so it was weird. You had a situation where you had this revolutionary black government, but all of the employees, not all, but many of the employees of the government of Zimbabwe were white. And they demanded, a lot from the black revolutionary government. Oh, you want us to stay here and not flee? You want us to keep running the Department of Education or the Department of Health or whatever? Well, you got to pay us lots of money. And so you could look at the government of Zimbabwe and you could be like, wow, well, it's not really an anti-imperialist government. You know, it says it's for the black people, but if you look at the government bureaucracy, it's all full of white people and they get paid these fancy salaries. What are they supposed to do in that kind of situation? They redistributed the land. They redistributed the land. They were faced with U.S. sanctions. They nationalized the diamond mines. They wiped out illiteracy in Zimbabwe. They did a lot of good stuff, but they did it in the face of an onslaught by imperialism, and they did it having to have a corrupt bureaucracy, right? They having to have a bureaucracy to do it, and that bureaucracy. This is how these things work, right? That you don't get to. This is a very important point, right? And Lenin makes this point. He says, in socialism, inequality exists and unjust inequality exists, right? Socialism is not heaven on earth, right? Socialism is a society where capitalism has been abolished. It's where the banks, factories, and industries and the centers of economic power are organized to serve public good and not the profits of a few. But it's not paradise, and there's inequality in socialism, and there's, that's one of these people who tried to like get me. He's like, there's income inequality in China. It's like, no shit. Of course there is. There's been income inequality in every socialist society. There and there people at the top of these societies take care of themselves, and the bureaucracy can be self-serving in some cases. None of that should be a shocker. And if you want to talk, who are the people who are enriching themselves at the expense of the whole world? That's U.S. imperialism. Who are the people who are keeping the world poor so that they can stay rich? It's Wall Street and London. But this Panama Papers narrative that they used to go after Lula da Silva, they've used it to go after Alex Saab, they've used it to go after Isabel dos Santos, they've used it to demonize Russia. It is such a bunch of malarkey. It's like, are you surprised? You look into these details. It's like, yes, people in anti-imperialist governments have good salaries. People in I hate this stuff. I really, and it's like the more you look into it, the more it's just like, yes, yes, heads of state take care of their relatives. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's good, but it's a fact of life. And if you don't think that the U.S. imperialists, Hunter Biden, folks, Hunter Biden, give me a break, and it's just, look, the world is an ugly place. The world is a very ugly place. It's an ugly place, and politics is an ugly business, and it's like, but they just, they use this narrative. They've discovered it's way more effective than using the politics. They start just saying, well, socialism and communism are evil. They should be killed for being communists. It doesn't work. But if it turns into they should be killed because they have a fancy car, there's a lot of progressive-minded people who will go along with it, and that's the problem. And that's part of the way this stuff works. And people don't get this. We shouldn't expect socialist countries to be paradises. We should expect them to have bureaucracies. We should expect them to have to make compromises. We should expect them to have to make deals with U.S. oil companies. And, we should expect them to have to bring in foreign investment. They're doing the best they can, okay? In some cases, they might be able to improve. They might, but overall, that any socialist country exists in the sea of evil capitalism in the world and imperialism is a miracle. Socialism is going to win, but it's going to be a long, difficult, struggle. And we should get beyond these kind of petty narratives. What are you being for Halloween? I don't know. I don't plan on dressing up. I really don't plan on dressing up. But there you go. But you'll see me on Halloween. I'll be on tomorrow, so don't worry. I'll be back tomorrow, probably twice. Probably twice. So there you go. I'll be back. I'll be back. So listen, folks, it's been fun. It's been a fun night. I hope we got something out of this stream. I hope it was productive. It's always productive to engage with all of you. I love you all. We're an amazing, growing community. We are marching ahead. We are marching toward 2022. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night, everybody. Have a good night.